And we're live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Ouroboros Seminar. This is the 10th installment, if I'm not mistaken. As most of you probably know, the Ouroboros Seminar is dedicated to the exploration of the fascinating legacy of Francisco Varela. As you also probably know, we meet every first and third Wednesday in the month, and we are having these sessions up till December. My name is Sebastjan. I will be the moderator of this session and most of the other sessions. Before we begin, as usual, a few words about the organizational aspect of this particular event. So the event is organized jointly by the research group Metanoia, by the Mind and Life Europe and Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana. In general, the Ouroboros Seminar is part of a broader initiative started by Mind and Life Europe, which is centered around two important anniversaries, namely the 20th anniversary of Francisco Varela's passing in 2001 and the 30th anniversary of the publication of the monumental and groundbreaking book, The Embodied Mind. Many things are happening in the context of this broader initiative. So again, I would kindly ask Gabor Karsai, the Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe, to bring us up to speed as to what's in store in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you, Sebastjan. It's going to be just a short announcement that our Francisco and Friends series will continue on October 13th, next Wednesday, with the fifth event. Our guest speakers will be Antoine Lutz and Jean-Philippe Lachaud, two doctoral students of Francisco, and they will speak about their experiences in the lab that they lived with Francisco. And the title of their speech dialogue will be the Francisco Varela Experience. Are you experienced? It's a really fascinating title and topic, so I'm looking forward to welcoming you all there. And if you are interested to join, please register via the MLE website.
Thank you very much, Gabor. Sounds very interesting. Now on to the formalities about the seminar. The seminar lasts approximately 30 to 45 minutes. Usually we're covering 1 to 2 different papers. And then the presentations are followed by a 60 to 90 minute discussion. You can post your questions in the chat, or you can post them also on YouTube. The event is namely also streamed there. If you want me to read out the questions, make sure that you notify me of that. If not, of course, and we prefer that you read them out loud yourself. I would kindly ask you to try to keep the questions to the point, well structured, nice, clear, and cogent. And also a call out to, again, as usual, younger generations of researchers to speak up and take the front stage. Finally, we have a Discord channel. Fortunately, it's not particularly active, but one never knows. Hope dies last, they say. And you're more than welcome to join that Discord channel so that we can expand and further discuss certain topics that are not resolved during the discussion itself. And also, finally, you can find all the relevant information about this event on the Mind and Life and Metanoia websites, and you can also follow us on Twitter. Okay, so today's paper is The Gesture of Awareness, an account of its structural dynamics. And the paper was written by Nathalie Deprat, Francisco Varela, and Pierre Vermersch. Today's presenter is Claire Petitmengin. Claire is currently Professor Emerita in philosophy at the Institut Minet Telecom and member of the Husserl archives at École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her research focuses on the usually unrecognized dynamics of lived experience and microphenomenological methods, enabling us to become aware of it and highlight its essential structures. She studies the epistemological conditions of these methods, as well as their educational, therapeutic, artistic, and contemplative applications. She currently devotes herself to exploring the links between the ecological crisis and our blindness to our experience. She has written numerous scientific articles and 2 books, L'Expérience intuitive and Le Chemin de Milieu. She also edited 10 years of Viewing from Within, the legacy of Francisco Varela, which commemorates the 10th anniversary of the publication of The View from Within, wherein Francisco Varela designed the foundations of a research program of lived experience, or the research of lived experience. And the topic, this is precisely the topic of the paper that we will be covering. I'm very happy to have Claire, who is one of the utmost researchers and scholars in this particular field today with us today. So without further ado, Claire, if it's all right to you, I would pass on the word to you. And maybe as a starter, if that's okay with you, or maybe you can also touch upon that later on, maybe you can say a word or 2 about your experience with Francisco in person, how you got to know him, how you got to work with him, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Claire, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sebastjan. Francisco was my PhD thesis advisor. I don't know what to say. I met him. I was, in fact, I was looking for a thesis advisor in cognitive science, and a friend of mine gave me the book, The Embodied Mind, and in the book I discovered that Francisco was also a meditation practitioner. In fact, I had written my ME thesis on the issue of emptiness in Indian Buddhism. So I said to myself, oh, I would like so much to have this man as a PhD advisor. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I was in Prague presenting a paper at the International Congress of Systemics. And he was, I didn't know that, but he was invited as a presenter. And so I asked him, I talked to him. And finally, a few weeks later, I began my thesis with him. And it was the beginning of this story of exploring, finding methods to explore lived experience. And yeah, a long story, because it was in 1993 when I met him. And so
marvelous, Claire. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for this glimpse.
And thank you for, I would like to share. Thank you very much for inviting me, Sebastjan and Ami and Gabor, to participate in the Ouroboros seminar. So this paper, The Gesture of Awareness, an account of its structural dynamics, is in fact a 14-pages article published in 1999, which is the core of the work then in preparation on Becoming Aware, a Pragmatics of Experiencing, a book of almost 300 pages, which will appear in 2003 after Francisco passed away. The text of the article is found more or less identically in the first chapter of this book under the name Epoché. So it's a little strange for me to present this article in the online presence of Natalie, one of the authors. But Natalie was offered to present another article on November 17th. So her presence will give us the opportunity to ask her any questions we wish to ask. Oh. Yeah. So the title is very concise and powerful. The main title, The Gesture of Awareness, implies that there is a form of unconsciousness or unawareness, but that it is possible to lift this unconsciousness, to become aware. It also says that this awareness is the result of a gesture, a particular act. And the subtitles specify that this act as a dynamics consists of a particular process. And this dynamics has a generic structure. Whenever the process of becoming aware occurs, the dynamics of the process presents regularities, regardless of the content one becomes aware of, the content which is discovered. In a word, becoming aware is not an event that occurs completely randomly, but an act which has a generic structure. This discovery has important epistemological consequences to which I will come back at the end of this presentation. So in the mid-90s, the three researchers who were all dedicated to the study of human lived experience set out to compare the processes of becoming aware put into practice in their respective disciplines. Natalie was a young and valiant philosopher engaged in contemporary developments in phenomenology, notably Husserlian phenomenology. Pierre, a researcher in psychology, had developed an innovative method for becoming aware of the experience associated with performing an action and describing it very precisely. L'entretien d'explicitation. Francisco had just published the founding article of neurophenomenology, commented on by Antoine Lutz a few weeks ago, in which he defended the urgent need to develop methods of rigorous description of lived experience. The three researchers were all engaged in a spiritual practice, Francisco being an experienced practitioner of Buddhist meditation in the tradition of Mahamudra Dzogchen. The three methods, phenomenology, the explicitation interview, and Buddhist meditative practice, start from a surprising and disturbing observation. Living an experience does not necessarily mean recognizing it, being fully present in it, being fully aware of it. Our lived experience, in other words, what is most intimate and closest to us, escapes us. Our awareness of it is not only partial, but mistaken. We don't see it as it is. We need training to learn to recognize what, nevertheless, is there. What prevents us from being aware, from seeing what is there? The classical phenomenological tradition incriminates the natural attitude, the tendency to superimpose to experience preconceptions and theorizations about it, and notably, the implicit belief in the absolute existence of an objective world independent of experience, in which we are absorbed. From the perspective of the explicitation interview, which is based in particular on Piaget's theory of becoming aware, our actions are experienced in an essentially pre-reflective way, in the sense that the action has an autonomous knowledge, remains largely opaque. There is no intrinsic necessity in order to be able to do something, to know how to do it. In the Buddhist tradition, the lack of consciousness which afflicts our experience is called avidya, an ignorance which has the power not only to hide, to veil the true nature of phenomena, but to superimpose on it the appearance of a solid world, distinct and independent from a solid subject, an illusion which is the source of deep suffering, dukkha. But the good news in all three approaches is that there is something to do, something you can do, learn to do, to become aware of what eludes you. At the same time, this something to do is eminently paradoxical. How can I aim for something that I don't know that I know, while I don't know that I don't know it? This is the whole difficulty and mystery of the process of becoming aware, which the authors set themselves the goal to elucidate. The objectives of the act of becoming aware in the three approaches are different. The phenomenological approach, at least Husserlian, has an essentially gnoseological goal, which is to discover the structures of human experience, in particular, the structures of our relation to the world, the subject-object structure. For the explicitation interview, the objective is pragmatic. It is a question of becoming aware of and describing the pre-reflective acts which are mobilized by an expert action. One of Pierre's first researches concerned the way in which expert pianists memorized their scores. For the meditation practitioner, the objective is soteriological. It's a question of recognizing the natural state of the mind, which ordinarily we don't recognize in order to become free from suffering. Despite this difference in objective, the three authors start from the hypothesis that the process of awareness is such an elementary human act that it is in reality quite independent of the original context and that it presents a generic structure. To try to highlight this structure, the authors wish to adopt a resolutely empirical approach, which is very firmly claimed at the beginning of the text, which almost takes on the tone of a manifesto. Our work is rooted in a renewed contemporary phenomenology. The phenomenology we advance is characterized by the way it works, its operational, procedural, or performative dimension. It's not a question of making the exegesis of the phenomenological texts which have discussed the process of becoming aware by adding endlessly commentaries upon commentaries. But it's a question of describing the practice of this gesture. What is important to us is actually to engage directly in the description of phenomena. Only this allows moving forward in refining past work and to confirm or invalidate past descriptions. That, rather than the discussion of the descriptions of other phenomenologists, is our project. The resulting structure is not presented as a finalized result, but as a first attempt, a work in progress, born from the exploration of a new field, terra incognita, they said, of which we know almost nothing and that we are discovering. One morning, the three colleagues had an appointment in Francisco's office at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Francisco had just drawn the following diagram on the wall of his office to try to represent visually the generic structure that was emerging from their work. They spent the whole day discussing this diagram, which has been little modified afterwards. Natalie told me this, in fact, this secret a few days ago. So this diagram represents the initial stage of the process of becoming aware, the epoché. This initial step is followed by a stage of intuitive evidence, which is itself the prerequisite of the optional stages of expression and validation. The article focuses on the initial stage of epoché. In other words, it is interested in the gestures that prepare the possible emergence of something into awareness, not in this emergence itself, nor in the process of describing what has emerged, nor in the process of validating this description. These other stages are described in the book, in fact. The epoché has an iterative structure made up of three main stages or gestures: suspension, conversion or redirection, and letting go. Strictly speaking, the epoché corresponds to the first one, the suspension. But as this gesture is constantly reactivated, it gives its name to the whole process. After this rather long preliminary, I will try to describe each of these three gestures. To facilitate the description, I will rely on a distinction which is implicit in the paper between three types of acts: the gestures of becoming aware, the gestures that prevent one from becoming aware, that conceal or veil experience. In the paper, they are sometimes described explicitly, but sometimes also in negative through the description of the difficulties in performing the gestures of awareness. And third, the devices used to elicit, to trigger the gestures of becoming aware, which are specific to each method. The article calls them skillful practices, the term used by Buddhist meditation textbook. So first, suspension. The first gesture is the one on which the article gives the fewest details. It's described as a break with the nature or non-examined attitude, taken its broad sense of tendency to superimpose on lived experience, judgments, evaluations, and explanations about it. To become aware of our experience, we must first abandon the representation we make of it, to which we hold very firmly. Just as someone who spontaneously draws a table as he knows it is rectangular, must first abandon this representation to be able to see it as it really appears to her. That is like a distorted parallelogram. The article identifies three non-exclusive possible triggers of this suspension. The suspension may be triggered by an external or existential event. It may be learned thanks to a self-imposed discipline. It may also be induced by somebody else, like a therapist, a meditation teacher, or an interviewer. For example, in an explicitation interview, the main technique used by the interviewer to trigger this suspension is to invite the interviewed person to choose and to explore a singular experience, precisely situated in space and time, a precondition for someone to become aware of what she lives, instead of remaining locked in representation of what she thinks she lives. Each time the interviewed person caught up in the natural attitude deviates towards generalities or judgments, the interviewer gently and firmly brings her back to the singular experience which is being described. The second gesture of the process of becoming aware is presented as a gesture of conversion of the direction of attention from the exterior world to the interior world. It is the inversion of the gesture which underlies the natural attitude taken in its more restricted sense of absorption into the object or content of the experience, or into its objective when I am performing an action. Husserl describes this conversion as a change of attitude in the relationship I maintain with the world. It is the conversion of the natural interest from an object, whatever it is, towards the act, which allows me to access it. It is the shift from the object to the act, or again, a passage from the quod to the commodo. As the article doesn't give concrete examples of this gesture, allow me to offer two. When an idea occurs to me, for example, such as the idea of a solution to a problem that bothers me, my attention is absorbed into the content of the idea. And this absorption somehow conceals the process of emergence of the idea, which remains unnoticed. To become aware of this, I have to redirect my attention from the content, the what of the idea, towards the how of its emergence, towards its microgenesis. Oh, okay. I had a little surprise, but it doesn't work. I wanted to produce a sound. It doesn't work. Never mind. When a sound occurs, my immediate reaction is to identify the object that produces the sound. What is it? In fact, it was the song of a blackbird. It's the song, and this immediate focus on what is at the origin of the sound conceals the how, the microgenesis of this experience. To become aware of it, I have to release the tension towards the object, which is at the source of the sound, the blackbird, for example, and redirect it towards how I recognize this blackbird. Song. So, both the explicitation interview and the meditation manuals offer skillful practices to trigger this conversion, such as the inhibition. Can you see my screen? Because
yes.
Okay, I hope you can see it.
I mean, a part of it is slightly cut off, like the left side.
One of these skillful practices is the inhibition of action. For example, the meditation practitioner, at least up to a certain level of expertise, is invited to disengage from action by adopting a still seated position during meditation sessions, but also by respecting periods of retreat cut off from any worldly activity. The reorientation of attention is also fostered by techniques which elicit fine attention to bodily sensations. In the practice of meditation, this movement is first elicited in shamatha by the required attention to bodily position and breath, and then refined in Vipassana, where the practitioner is notably asked to feel precisely all the bodily areas mobilized by breathing, its subtle changes in rhythm and amplitude, and to gradually expand this fine mode of attention to all bodily sensation. In the explicitation interview, this descent into the body is elicited by the form of memory which is mobilized to evoke the experience, a concrete memory which reactivates the experience in all its sensory and emotional dimensions. Agreeing to release my grip on objects is giving up the control I think I have over my experience, and take the risk of discovering something about myself, something intimate that I don't know yet. It is accepting to put myself in a position of vulnerability. It's for this reason that the relationship of confidence in the person who guides me in this work is essential, whether it is a therapist, an interviewer, or a meditation teacher. The third phase of the process of becoming aware is described as a gesture of letting go. It's a change in the quality rather than in the direction of attention. It consists of passing from the voluntary inward direction of attention to a simple receptivity, from a looking for to a letting come, a letting reveal itself. As the term letting come seems to me much better suited to characterize this attitude of receptivity and welcome than the term of letting go, which was chosen by the authors. It's the one I will use from now, because for me it's much more meaningful. So I've already discussed this point with Natalie. So this gesture is paradoxical in a way, because unlike the immobile hunter who knows at least what he is awaiting, I'm waiting for something that I have no idea, that I cannot aim for. All I can do is to adopt the attitude of receptivity, which will allow it to reveal itself by itself. Adopting this receptive mode does not guarantee the immediate disclosure of the unrecognized. This gesture is thus often followed by a period of latency, of silence, by a gap. For example, I don't know, could you listen? Have you heard the sound I produced? Can you answer me? No?
No,
okay.
At least I haven't.
Okay. So interviewed person, when we ask them a question about an experience they had, often answer by saying, I don't know, nothing happened. I have nothing to say, it's confused. This moment of silence may even be associated with a feeling of fright, in French, effroi, as Pierre Vermeersch used to call it. At this moment, it is tempting to succumb to this fear by filling in prematurely the gap with a representation of the experience, with concepts or words that are already available. But stop the emergence into awareness of something new. In order to avoid this temptation, one has to reactivate the gesture of suspension. In fact, the gesture of suspension permeates every step of the process of becoming aware. After this time of relative emptiness, something may take form and emerge into awareness. Francisco liked to take the example of the emergence of a three-dimensional image from a cloud of dots. an experience of which Antoine made the neurophenomenological analysis in each PhD thesis with Francisco. But this emergence into consciousness is another story, the story of the intuitive evidence, second stage of the process of becoming aware after the epoché. In this stage, with much surprise, I recognized something that I was living without recognizing that I was living it. However, it's not described in the paper, but in the second section of the book on becoming aware. Now, if I may, I would like to share with you a few reflections about the process of becoming aware I just presented. These thoughts stem, it's more now the second party of my presentation, which is shorter, is more an invitation for the discussion which will follow. And the thought that I am going to share, that I would like to share first, stem from my meditative practice in the tradition of Mahmoud Redirection, from my practice of microphenomenology, an extension of the explicitation interview to research, and from my attempt to compare both practices in a paper recently published. So my interrogation starts from the following sentence. Whereas the first reversal, the conversion, remains governed by the traditional distinction between interior and exterior, that is to say, driven by a sort of an enhanced duality, and involves a portion of undeniably voluntary activity, the second, letting come, is characterized by a passive, receptive waiting, which moves exactly in the opposite direction of the previous duality, a transient erasing of the inside-outside direction. So this sentence describes a kind of contradiction between the gesture of conversion from the outside to the inside, which supposes and even accentuates the distinction between the two spaces, and the gesture of letting come, which, on the contrary, softens this distinction. I could not find a precise development of this observation, either in the article or in the book, but it seems to me to be crucial. In fact, this contradiction, can you see my screen well, or only a part of it?
Only the part of it, but enough to fill it in.
Okay.
with the content. So
okay, I'm sorry, but I think you can guess what is on the left. So this contradiction seems to disappear if the first gesture doesn't consist in reorienting from outside to inside a voluntary and focused attention, which would simply change direction, but in releasing the tension towards the object, whether this object is perceived as exterior, like a sound, or interior, like a thought. In other words, the contradiction resolves if this initial gesture is reduced to the very first movement of the conversion, that is the gesture of loosening the grasp on the object. This gesture of loosening has the effect of weakening, diluting the solidity of the object. As the object loses its solidity, the subject also weakens. Simultaneously, the separation usually perceived between an interior and an exterior space dissolves, sometimes instantaneously, but most often gradually. the sound is not perceived over there, outside my body. The thought doesn't emerge inside, in my mind, but the sound, as well as the thought, emerge in a space where the distinction between inside and outside and between mind and body fades. I rely on descriptions, that microphenomenological descriptions that were provided by meditation practitioners. So in meditation, in meditative practice, this loosening gesture is repeated over and over again until the most subtle tensions dissolve. Reality being emptied of its substantiality, it becomes more and more transparent. Ultimately, all what remains is the clarity of consciousness. In the explicitation interview, it's different, very different. The objective of the interview is first to recognize and describe previously unnoticed dimensions of a given experience, such as the memorization of a score, the emergence of an idea, the perception of a sound, the appearance of an emotion of surprise. And the objective is to recognize and describe this, the pre-reflective dimensions of such experiences for gnoseological or pragmatic purposes. The loosening phase is therefore followed by a phase of letting come, a waiting phase, and then by a phase of filling in by something which was there without being recognized. For example, the feeling of the sound that precedes the identification of the source of the sound, or the felt meaning that silently guides the process of ideation. This is the phase of intuitive evidence, followed by a phase of meticulous description. It's not necessary, in order to describe this subtle phenomena, to quiet down completely the process of co-emergence of the subject and object. It would just be irrelevant to the objective of the investigation. But the meditation practitioner doesn't have the objective of describing. She doesn't expect anything. If something appears, even a surprisingly subtle object, she learns not to grasp it. She does nothing. And the object ends up dissolving on its own. All the practitioner has to do is doing nothing at all. That is to say, releasing any tension until the duality completely vanishes. While in the microphenomenological interview, the loosening of the tension is temporary and prepares for a letting come, a filling in, the meditative releasing is a radical, definitive one, which has been compared to the movement of a bale of straw when you cut the tie that binds it. Both the interview method and the meditation manuals offer skillful means to release the tension towards the object. For example, the interview consists in exploring a given past experience, which is reenacted or presentified during the interview. The experience being past, the objective has already been achieved. The loosening of the tension towards the objective is thus fostered by the very structure of the interview. So evocation is a very skillful means in this respect. In meditative practice, this loosening is elicited by the instruction not to feed the phenomenon that appears, whatever it is, not to foster, sustain it. The instruction is often leave it without support. The more skillful this gesture becomes, the earlier the tension which solidifies the object is recognized, the lighter and more transparent the phenomenon becomes, and the more the subject-object dyad subtilizes. So this process of vanishing of the subject-object dyad and the recognition of its process of co-constitution are the core of Buddhist meditative practice. They have been described at length by Buddhist epistemology on the basis of this practice. Now, as a conclusion, I would like to ask two questions. The first one is, how does a generic structure, a generic experiential structure emerge? Neither in the article nor in the book do the authors give precise details on how they arrived at this generic structure. How did it emerge? How did they discover it? How did they become aware of it? The three phases of the awareness process represent the content of the structure, the what, but we know little about the how, which has probably remained largely pre-reflective. Hence, my question. My second question is the following. What is the interest of highlighting the generic structure of the process of becoming aware? Highlighting this structure is, in my view, essential because it allows the development of a performative understanding of the validity of phenomenological descriptions as opposed to a correspondentist understanding. Indeed, it's not possible to evaluate directly the correspondence of the content of a description, for example, I am joyful, with the content of the experience of joy. All we can do is to evaluate the acts that generate this description, acts that can be performed in naive or skilled way. If the process of becoming aware of an experience and describing it was completely random, had no structure, it would be impossible to assess these acts. But the fact that there is a generic structure of this process, made up of precise acts of which it is possible to provide accurate descriptions, makes it possible to assess whether the process is performed correctly or not, thanks to clues of the correct realization of these acts. Moreover, importantly, the existence of this generic structure allows a research team to reproduce this act in order to verify the results obtained by another team. In other words, this structure makes it possible to get verifiable and falsifiable results, the kingpin of any scientific validation. In other words, the existence of a generic dynamic structure of the process of becoming aware of an experience and describing it makes it possible to develop a disciplined study of lived experience. That's why refining our knowledge of the acts that enable this process and of the acts that elicit this process is essential to refine and improve these acts, to trigger, guide, and teach them more efficiently, to evaluate the various degrees of mastery of these acts through precise criteria, to compare what different methods do in order to trigger, guide, and teach these acts. This makes it possible to evaluate to what extent different methods are compatible and complementary, and which one is more adapted to the description of which type or dimension of experience. And finally, refining our knowledge of these acts also allows the creation of a more and more refined shared vocabulary, an essential condition for constituting a research community in the domain of experiential research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Claire. This was very, very thorough, and also you've managed to elaborate quite a bit on the paper itself and open many topics, which surprisingly to me were basically addressed to some of the questions that were sent to me already before this session. So that was very interesting. Maybe at this point we can stop the presentation so that we get the.
I would like to. I cannot find the
button.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, there it is. Okay, so Natalie is saying that she managed to hear the whole presentation, and she's happy about it, which is nice. So maybe I would start with something that is that you've basically, in a certain sense, already touched upon to a certain degree, Claire, when you were talking about the meditative experiences and how epoché is embodied in them. And Viktorija, who usually takes care of YouTube and some other technical stuff, but unfortunately for some specific reasons couldn't attend today, sent one question that I will be posting into the chat, but I will also read it out loud. Namely, Viktorija, together with Urban and Toma, who are also here today, is involved in the first person research of, among other things, meditative experiences and so on and so forth. So she's very interested in this very practical approach to the study of experience. And what she's basically asking in the question is, so we usually get these theoretical descriptions or theoretical accounts of epoché, say in the classical phenomenological texts. But she is interested if you, as someone who has been working very actively with the microphenomenological interview and the very, let's say, practical research of experience, whether you could maybe say a bit more about how your co-researchers describe their acts of gestures and epoché. So what is their actual concrete experiences of this happening? If you have anything you might say to this or add to this. And then maybe also Urban can chime in and other people.
First, I would say that we don't talk about the epoché. As microphenomenologists, we are not, it's a concept, we don't start from a concept, the concept of epoché, to explore the process of becoming aware. We just start from our experience of becoming aware. So we don't try to say, oh, is it an epoché or is it not an epoché? Or no, it's not our problem. I'm sorry to be, I'm a little rough, a little, but it's just like this.
Mm-hmm.
But I have something to say about it. So if epoché is the suspension, is defined as the suspension of the natural attitude, which consists in being absorbed in the objects, in the external world, I'm sorry, can you ask the question again? Was it about meditation or the?
No. The say, okay, so the term epoché in this particular paper as well, right, is presented in a fairly broad sense. So also the meditative experiences are also included. But Viktorija would just basically be interested that if during your microphenomenological interviews and research in general have encountered some like concrete experiences, what in this particular paper, for instance, falls under this broad category of epoché. So even if you don't necessarily call it epoché, anything that would somehow fall in this maybe triad that is presented here as epoché, suspension, conversion, letting go, and maybe just I'm assuming, unfortunately Viktorija is not here, so I cannot ask her, but you know, whether people have a specific way of presenting it, or how they experience it, or how they if they have any, you know, specific way of describing it, maybe. I don't know.
May I help?
Yes, surely.
Hi, Claire. It was great. It was so pleasant to hear all this, which I find one of the most important works, by the way, by Varela and co. And not enough researched, I would like to say. I think, I mean, I am a supervisor of what Viktorija is doing, so I hope I will go into the right direction, but I am apologizing in advance to Viktorija. Perhaps I will miss. But the question is, she's studying exactly what you were talking about, the gesture of meditation, the gesture of and there is this presupposition that there might be some similarities between epoché and this gesture of meditation, as authors of the paper also made these similarities. And I think that her question is, I will add a little bit to this question. Do you think that do you have some phenomenological, some data about how people experience this gesture? And I would add, do you feel that there are some differences? Because when talking about general structure of this gesture, it seems like there is only one gesture and then only one result. But the question is this really so? Or are there some differences? We call them, as you know, horizons. And can you find out in your body of research that if people do one part of this gesture a bit different, that the results might also be a bit different? So I think this is the question. It was not the question about interview. It was the question about what can you find through your interviews about this approach to meditation.
So it's oriented, the question is about meditation.
Yes, but what you found out in your body of work about that?
In fact, I think it's what I tried to explain in my commentary of the text, is that it's the epoché as the suspension. Epoché in meditative practice, the epoché is not the suspension of the natural attitude. It's not the epoché as it is defined in phenomenology, as I understand it. I'm not maybe the best person to explain this, but epoché is defined as a suspension of the natural attitude. Meditation practitioners doesn't practice that. Epoché, they don't suspend the natural attitude. They loosen the natural attitude. The absorption into the object, the tension, let's say the tension towards the object is loosened. It's not a question of deciding to suspend it for a moment, which would be very, very difficult, but because how to do that? It's a question of loosening the tension moment after moment, until the very structures of experience, the subject-object poles becomes more and more subtle and finally vanish. So it's I would say it is the vanishing of the structure of object dyad through the loosening of the tension toward the object, which triggers the the vanishing of the subject, and finally of the dyad. And progressively, this dyad becomes more and more subtle, subtilizes. So it's a sort of epoché, but in fact not a suspension, a loosening, which creates, which is at the same time the consciousness, which provides the consciousness of the acts that create the dyad. In fact, loosening the tensions which create the separation, the subject-object couple, makes you understand at the same time. It is loosening is understanding how they are created. The vanishing of the dyad is the understanding of the co-construction of this dyad. So I'm not sure I am very clear. I think I'm not very clear. But all that to say that this epoché, which is never used, a word that is never used by meditation practitioners. So that's why it's very difficult to answer the question, really. But let's say that if the epoché is the suspension of a natural attitude consisting of believing in a word, in the solid existence of a word independent of me, in fact, this is done by meditation practitioners, but in a way which is very, very concrete, which is just the dissolution of both.
So, Claire, if I understand you correctly here, what you're in a certain sense saying or describing, so two things maybe. One is that this ties in very nicely and neatly with the text that we were talking about last time. So phenomenology of shunyata and what Francisco was trying to develop there. So the notion of shunyata comes very close to what you're describing now, where the understanding of the dyad or the co-creation of the dyad is precisely in the disappearance of the dyad, so to speak. Yeah. And also what I was reminded of the description of epoché in basically the preface to Phenomenology of Perception, where Merleau-Ponty says that what is crucial to epoché or phenomenological reduction is basically the loosening of intentional threads. This came close to what you were saying in a certain sense, right? In the sense of that the threads, the intentional threads are loosened, but if I understand you correctly, that they're not completely, in a certain sense, put in abeyance or put outside of existence. Is that somewhat in the direction of what you were saying with regards to?
I think so. But there is a big difference, maybe, that this epoché, the meditative epoché, let's say, is not decided at the beginning of the practice. It is the end result, the final result of a long-term practice. The epoché is not at the beginning, it is at the end. So this loosening is a result. Yeah, it marks the full realization of this process of loosening after maybe years of practice, or sometimes instantaneously, but it is very seldom that it happens. So the big difference is that it is not with the phenomenological epoché. It is not positive. It is not decided that at the beginning. It's not it is the end.
Okay. I think I understand this general direction. I would maybe, given the fact that we've been talking a lot about meditation and epoché and how they differ and whatnot, and you already provided a commentary to this towards the end of your talk, and even now, but Adnan sent an interesting question that is related to this, and I will ask him to ask the question. And I think it's interesting because, again, it touches upon something that Evan might have something to say about, and also, again, Urban and others who are working on this interface of meditation and first-person research. So, Adnan, I'll pose the question and you can maybe ask it.
Wait, you pose it and
I will post it into. I will post it into the. Yeah. Sorry. I will post it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically, to modify it a bit, the main thing I'd like to know is whether you think that there's a difference in degree or in quality between the epoché and meditative practice, because there are some structural similarities, but also huge contextual differences. Meditative practice is sort of a embodied long-term practice, unlike epoché.
Maybe if I add to this, Claire, and this is why I said that this is why I think Evan would maybe be somewhat interested in this particular question. In the concrete question that I posed in the chat, Adnan also talks about the overall context and the general aim of the practice. So, for instance, with epoché, you have this still. So, for instance, in the phenomenological inquiry, one of the goals is still to acquire certain descriptions and then certain justifications, for instance. This is not necessarily something that is present in the meditative practice. It has a very specific soteriological aim, and it is embedded in a framework which basically gives it direction, orientation, specific flavor, specific quality. Can we really just put this aside and pretend that it's not there? Is this feasible? Is this doable? Are we maybe idealizing too much specific structures, the meditative practice and phenomenological inquiry, just to get to certain similarities? I'm intentionally polarizing this a little bit so that the point is clearer.
Can I just say one little thing in defense of Viktorija's question, just to depolarize this a little bit? She was not so naive, and of course Claire is completely correct. This is probably not the same thing, epoché and the gesture of, let's say, mindful meditation, which of course, again, we know is a huge spectrum of techniques and so on. The interesting thing is actually her aim was to compare the gesture, exactly what you just asked, to compare the gesture of epoché and different gestures that people do when they meditate. But the problem is that within the phenomenological literature, it's really hard to find the description of epoché. And it's impossible to find phenomenologists who would say, oh yes, when I do epoché, I do it like that. I will give you a complete description of my experience while doing epoché. So that does not exist. Perhaps Fink was the closest to that. I actually have been present to some conference in Heidelberg where this question was addressed to Zahavi, and he said, I don't understand the question. No, just tell us, how do you do epoché? Let's go on. This is not an important question. That was his answer. So then we said, well, obviously, within the scope of things that we can observe empirically, the closest things to epoché seems to be some sort of mindfulness gesture. So that's how Viktorija came to this. She perhaps equaled this too quickly, and Claire was quite right to note that distinction. But we don't know how to do. There are no clear. Actually, there are three kinds of sort of clear instructions within phenomenology, within Husserl's phenomenology. So that's why we are now focusing on studying just this sort of bracketing or whatever of natural attitude or whatever within meditation. Just wanted to explain that we are not so naive.
No, this was not the presumption. I think in general, it was just I think that an add-on question, like a subsequent question to the.
Sure.
May I add something about this wonderful debate? I think that, you know, in the book on becoming aware and on the paper on which Claire did a beautiful talk, the issue is not to compare between the definition of epoché, the definition of mindfulness or meditation, the definition of what it is like to perform an explicitation interview. It is to compare three different acts of awareness and wonder whether there are some invariants between them. So, of course, some vocabulary comes from phenomenology because it's easier. But the most important point is not to make a rigid comparison, but rather a comparison in flux and looking for something that might be in common with the three gestures. The second thing is, just in the same spirit, is to ask whether it is useful to perform either the epoché to do meditation, or meditation to perform the phenomenological epoché, or elicitation interview to perform the two others. And this is the case, in fact. Well, we have done a few workshops with Claire and Nathalie, and it was striking to see several, several boosts to these three gestures from the others. For instance, when someone knows that he or she will be interviewed about her period of meditation, then this person becomes very exquisitely attentive to the details of what she is doing during the meditation, and therefore somehow it may enhance the capacities of the meditator to follow her path. And also the contrary, namely, I mean the reverse. It's absolutely obvious that, you know, people who meditate are very easy to interview with the explicitation interview, and also that they spontaneously perform the phenomenological epoché. For them, phenomenology, it's a matter of course, it's obvious. So clearly there are, you know, performative connections between the three approaches. And this is probably even more significant than an analogy of definition. For, as you know, definitions are not always very easy to give in this domain.
Thank you, Michel. That's a very nice intervention. Yes, and Claire?
So just, I don't know what is phenomenological epoché. I don't know how to do this. So for me, it's impossible. I confess that it is impossible to compare phenomenological epoché that I don't know how to do with meditation practice. All what I can compare is concrete practices, such as the microphenomenological interview. There is a concrete practice, so I can compare what I do in what is done in a microphenomenological interview, an explicitation interview, and in meditation, because there are gestures that I do, so I can compare them. The phenomenological epoché, I don't know what it is, so how can I compare? I'm sorry, so I cannot answer your question, Urban, because it's uncomparable. How can you compare something which is abstract and something very concrete? It's for me, it's impossible. So if somebody can teach me, I would be very interested. But for now, I think we spent with Michel and Nathalie much time at this workshop on the epoché. And it was very difficult because nobody was able to say, oh, I'm going to show what is an epoché. I take you and I will trigger this in you. I will help you to perform this. I will give you advice on how to do it. No, it never happened. So, no. Personally, I'm sorry to talk of myself. My interest is to compare what is concrete gestures, such as the concrete gestures that we do in microphenomenology, in meditation. And for example, there is one consists in releasing the tension towards the object. And it is very simple. In fact, it is just this, releasing the tension. And it has huge effects on the experience and on our awareness. So for me, this is interesting.
Claire, if I just chime in, could you maybe, this was also something that I jotted down while you were having your presentation. Could you maybe say a bit more on this, releasing the tension towards objects? So like, if you provide a concrete example and maybe so that it becomes more plastic or organic or vivid, what it means to release the tension with regards to a certain object. You've already talked about it during, of course, commentary, but just to make it, more, as I said, organic or plastic.
So, for example, I wanted to produce a sound, but it doesn't work. Maybe because the sound is on my computer and not on your.
It's like epoché. It's like epoché. Nobody can catch it.
So, when a sound occurs or anything, but let's take the example of a sound. I can just usually my attention becomes tensed on the sound, focused on the sound. I try to recognize the object there, far from me, which is at the source of the sound. And in fact, this tension creates a separation between the object there and me who is there. And this, and in a fraction of a second, the separation between a subject and an object is created. So, and we do this all the time. So, meditation, as I understand it, is releasing this tension. It's a very simple gesture. There are a huge amounts of skillful practices to try to trigger the gesture. That's why I find this distinction between the gesture and the techniques which try to trigger the gesture. So that there are many thousands of techniques, but one gesture, one very simple gesture. So in meditation, so this is the gesture which dissolves the separation between subject and object. And this gesture is just a tension, which is very painful, in fact. So, and progressively in meditation, you learn to release it, to loosen it. And so it's very, but in the microphenomenological interview, there is something like this also. because in fact, the tension veils more subtle dimensions of the experience. For example, when you are tensed towards the object at the origin of the sound, you're not aware of the feeling you have of the sound, because the sound is, in fact, is felt in your body. So we call this, in microphenomenology, the felt sound, but you're not aware of this. So releasing the tension on the object makes you aware of the felt sound. So you're not interested in the object anymore. You're interested in the felt sound. But the difference between meditation and the microphenomenological interview is that in meditation, you don't make this felt sound as an object. You release the tension towards this felt sound, which is subtle, more subtle than the object sound. You release this also. And the more subtle dimensions emerge, the more but in the interview, it's different. You are interested in this felt sound, which has emerged. You take it as an object of investigation. You describe it, you create a vocabulary. So this is the difference, because you are interested in this subtle dimension of experience, because it can be useful for many reasons, for agir, for acting, for action, or for in a psychotherapy, for example, or for many reasons. You explore this more subtle dimension, and after a moment it becomes more and more subtle, but you explore it as a new object. While in meditation, you release also the tension of this object, and the object becomes subtler and subtler and subtler. And you release and you release, and finally, what remains? Nothing. You awaken. It is. You become awake.
Yeah. Michelle, yes.
Just a point.
I don't know if it's clear. I try to give an example.
No, this was quite clear.
Yes.
Also, the difference that you portrayed now, it was very clear. Michelle, yes, you wanted to comment?
Yes, it's very good that Claire insisted on this idea of tension. And in order to make more bridges between the several disciplines that were compared in this paper on becoming aware, I could adduce two texts I have in memory now. One from Husserl of 1893, so much before even logical investigations, much before ideas and so on. And there he said, intentionality is literally, a tensed interest towards something that you want to reach. And this tension manifests in the guise of a muscular tension. You prepare for an action. You try to grasp something. You want to take it. So it was very concrete. For him, it was a tension. And the tension, he said, is almost painful. So it's very similar to what Claire said. The second point, the second text is a text by Jean-Paul Sartre in 1937, I think. It was La Transcendance de l'ego, Transcendence of the Ego, in which he says, usually in ordinary life, we are always in a terrible tension to separate ourselves from the objects and to constitute ourselves as the opposite of the object, as someone opposite to the object and who could grasp the object. And when suddenly this tension releases, which according to him is exactly the point that is aimed at by phenomenology, as soon as this tension releases, suddenly you prove relief. So it's very clear that even, you know, in the text of phenomenologists, you have some descriptions of this idea of tension, which is so important indeed. And I agree entirely with Claire about on this point. So here again, there is a bridge between the two disciplines.
Hey, thank you for this contribution, Michel. I have another question that was posed by Toma. Maybe Toma can ask the question himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Claire, for a really nice presentation, and also the discussion is very interesting for me. So I would be very, in a basic way, interested in how you, Claire, would understand what you call generic structure of, you know, experience or consciousness. But generic structure, what counts as a generic structure from the perspective of, you know, empirical research on experience? How do I know it's a generic structure?
And I would just like
naive, but I'm very interested in this. I would like to, you know, be able to say, this is generic structure. Of course, this is naive, but
I would like to be a bit of a devil's advocate here and maybe, you know, raise, as in poker, Tomas' question a bit. And yes, I would be very interested in hearing the answers from other people as well. Is it even possible to talk about generic structures? Aren't we, in a certain sense, always contextualized in one way or another, historically, socially, culturally, politically? Isn't it to a certain degree somewhat naive, somewhat unphenomenological to talk about these things in such loose terms? And again, I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate here. That's why I'm polarizing this question again. So maybe, Claire, you can answer in two layers, if you like. You can just answer the question that Toma posed and then address the more polemical one if you want, or if not, maybe somebody else can chime in.
Yeah, so if I can take a little example, for example, if I ask you to imagine a natural landscape that you a natural landscape. You can do this, okay? So the content of these landscapes are probably completely different. There is no one which is the same in each of your experiences, in each experiences of the experiences that you just had. But there we can probably find regularities. For example, one of them is the perceptual position in the landscape. You can imagine the landscape from the outside as a photograph or a film which is outside, or you are in the landscape, in the middle of the landscape. It is called the perceptual position that you adopt. It may be a first-person perceptual position if you are in the middle, or a third-person perceptual position if you look from outside. And this notion of perceptual position is part of the structure of an imaginary scene, of the experience of an imaginary scene. There is a content which is different from one experience to another one, and that we can find, in fact, in any experience, in any type of experience, a number of regularities that we call a structure, a generic structure, because they are there, whatever the experience, whatever the content of experience. Yes, whatever the content, you always have to have a perceptual position. It's very difficult to imagine a scene without a perceptual position. So to answer to Sebastjan now, is it possible that in some culture there is no perceptual position, for example? some people in the world, I don't know where, but they can imagine a scene without any perceptual position. For me, it's unconceivable, but maybe, or maybe, so, and I think that your question, Sebastjan, is very interesting. Are very generic structure really generic or dependent on the context, on the culture, or on the and this has to be verified concretely by really doing the work of collecting fine-grained description of experiences and highlighting the possible structures. For example, in Japan and in Australia and I don't know, in some countries which are very remote, and compare with the structures that we have highlighted in our Western civilization, in fact. It would be super interesting.
I would have maybe even a concrete example here, given the fact that you use the example of the natural landscape. There are several tribes in Australia, but also elsewhere, one of them being Gugu Yimitir, which when they refer to space or spatial directions, they don't use the egocentric or these relative terms such as right, left, up, down, and in front and back. So up, down, yes. But they use what is called the geocentric direction. So south, north, west, east. And they basically learn to use this from very early on. So when they're children, they already learn to do this. So they don't say things like it's on your left. They will say like you have to turn your car to the south, or you turn your car to the southeast, or you have a fly on the northern part of yourself. So they literally talk like this, and they've done several studies on them, and they have a perfect orientational pitch, so to speak. So you can put them in a space where it's dark or whatever, and they will be able to tell you where's south, where's north. They dream in that particular way. They remember films in that particular way, and this is very important. Because, for instance, when you and me, if we were to describe a certain scene that we saw in a movie, it wouldn't be important in which direction the TV screen was oriented, right? For them, it is. So when they have to describe a scene from a movie, they will say somebody was coming southward or somebody was coming northward, depending on how the TV screen was turned. So, for instance, if they were to be asked to envision a landscape, is this a completely trivial matter that they were enculturated into a certain structure where they have a very different fundamental, visceral attitude towards space? And this attitude, by the way, then also reflects on how they perceive time. So there were several experiments where you had to put specific items. For example, a child that's growing up, you had cards with different stages of a person's life, and then you had to position them in a specific direction. So we would normally do it from left to right? So somebody who is fluent in or who grew up in a Hebrew culture would do it the opposite way. But they do it, I forgot, from east to west or to west from east, something like that. So the direction changes depending on how they're oriented when you ask them the question. So if, say, they position them from west to east, if you ask them, how would you position these cards in time, they would position them like from right to left, or left to right, or up to down. Yeah. So it depending on how they're oriented with regards to the west. So again, like these very, one could say, pre-reflective attitudes towards very fundamental experiential categories might be somewhat different. Would this in any way whatsoever reflect on what we are talking about now, or is this something completely contingent?
No, I think it's related with this notion of experiential generic structure that we have to refine and not, it's important not to not take for granted that our experiential structure of the perceptual positions are universal. But just I would like to add something about this notion of perceptual position, is that it seems that meditation practitioner at a point, there is no perceptual position anymore. So that means something important. That means that all these structures that I insist on, that we can highlight in our experiences, they dissolve in meditation. They are not strong definitive structures, they are vanishing structures, in fact, because in meditation practice results in the dissolution of these structures also. So it's interesting to highlight them, but also try to understand, maybe to explore how they vanish. So for me, it's also a very interesting line of research, not only to identify possible generic structures, but how they vanish, how this, yes, through meditative practice, for example.
Okay, maybe this is somewhat related to what Florian Klauser is asking in YouTube. Namely, he asked the question I mean, we've touched upon it already, so maybe in performing the gesture of becoming aware, do you think there is a limit of the depth of the contents thus uncovered, or can we explore a single moment ad infinitum, forever uncovering the details?
I don't know. It's a question. I don't know. I never. Just to give a concrete example, there was a student of Pierre Vermersch called Eve Berger, who did a thesis on one moment of experience. And she used the technique of self-description, auto-elicitation, that she described this moment herself, without an interviewer, using the explicitation interview. So it's a self-description and auto-elicitation. And she came back and back and back on this moment, I think 12 times. And each time she came back to the moment and described it. She could refine the description and discovered elements that she was sure were there at the initial moment. At least she was sure. It was obvious to her. And were new, you know, so it seems that if you have time and if you, it could be interesting to try to do this, really take a moment and try to go further and further and further. So what is suggested in such a work in the self-description is to wait for a moment, to do a self-description and then wait and take it again after 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. And surprisingly, if you come back to this, new things emerge, but you have to pause. It's not, you cannot force yourself, you know, with a very direct attention to, yes, voluntary attention to try to extract and find something new. And no, it's not like this. But when you stop, when you, and it is exactly loosening the tension. When you loosen the tension, something new emerges. So that's, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so in a certain sense, yeah, it would be as if one is unweaving these different intentional threads one after the other. And one question that is heading in a somewhat different direction, and I will shorten it somewhat. It was posed by Miha, and it is related to the article itself. But I think it could be maybe also, broadened and maybe related to microphenomenological interview, because I remember that once at ESRI, you and I were talking about, we were talking about this in a seminar setting where you said that there are certain states or events that are not, that are problematic for these types of approaches. So the question that was posed by Miha is that it refers to a certain segment in the paper where it would seem that there are certain states or topics that are problematic to reflect upon. So are there any specific experiences, any specific events, any specific topics or issues that in general would be problematic, and which would these be? This would be the most interesting part, because it is mentioned that there are certain problematic topic or issues that can be problematic to reflect upon. But I don't know, from your concrete experience, say from the phenomenological interview perspective, or in general, what would you say?
No, in fact, I don't understand the question well, because I don't see in the paper. I don't see.
So the question is, that maybe there are certain contents that you reflect upon is more easily accessible, and some is not as easily accessible. So if which would be the contents, for example, or the experiences or the segments of experience that are more difficult to access, if you have any ideas on this. And I also remember that you said at that particular point that microphenomenological interview was not appropriate for the study of a certain type of experience, but unfortunately I cannot remember which one. Something unpleasant experiences, I think. Yeah, but okay, that's probably related to the fact because they're unpleasant and you don't want to evoke, maybe, I don't know.
No, but which paper are you talking about? Which papers? What is it? I cannot see.
Sorry, this is referring to the paper that we were all reading. So Miha was just focusing on one particular segment where it is mentioned briefly that the certain contents are more difficult, not as easily accessible. And then he broadened the question, asking whether there are certain topics or issues or contents or what have you that are more problematic to reflect upon in the experience.
No, I think the paper, The Gesture of Becoming Aware, it says that sometimes there is a resistance when what emerges to awareness is intimate, and there is a resistance to come into contact with this intimate dimension of experience. So in the micro-explicitation or micro-phenomenological interview, it was not created to explore, private experiences. Vermeersch used to make a distinction between intimate and private. So private is something which belongs to your life, your personal life, Your intimate is what you access in an explicitation interview. It's something that you don't know about yourself, but it's not private. For example, you discover that you have a perceptual position in a scene, and it's something intimate because you didn't know that before. So it's new for you. It's something that can be, can be surprising and a little destabilizing, but it's not. It's something very nothing private. So I think there may be a resistance to the intimate, and also a difficulty to explore the private with an explicitation interview, because an explicitation interview puts you in a very close contact with your experience. It reactivates the emotions, and so exploring a private, unpleasant experience, for example, in the interview is not made, has not been created to do this. An interviewer is not a therapist. It's not, so we have not the tools, the techniques to help somebody who really through an interview would contact something very difficult for her, in the sense of in a private situation, or so yes, it is somehow a limit of the interview for now, because we haven't, we don't have the, for example, me, I'm not a therapist. I have no tools for managing if somebody comes in contact with suffering, something difficult. So I know what I would do, but I'm not. It's not therapeutic. So yes, probably it's this type of experience that the interview is not to answer the question. I'm sorry, I'm very confused. So the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've covered you've mentioned approximately the general direction and some of the things that were. So one of the category would probably be this. You mentioned difficult
experiences.
And also the personal ones in this. What exactly did you mean by personal experiences? So you have intimate experiences, which, for example, would be the perspectivity that's there, but you don't necessarily know that it's there, and then you become aware of it. That would be an intimate experience. But the personal experience would be just what, like personal preferences?
No, private is, for example,
private, yes.
Private. For example, private is a memory very personal memory coming from my childhood. It's private. And the explicitation interview is not, you can explore this experience with an interview very precisely, but it's not, it has not been created to explore private experiences, which may be difficult to relive, to reactivate. Intimate would be, for example, when I discover the tension. When I begin to discover this, how I create the objects through my tensions to them. It's not something private. It's not something about my childhood, by my husband or my it's really but it's really intimate. It's really the core of my experience, which is maybe generic. It's not private. So in that case, the explicitation interview maybe can explore the intimate. But if you want to go very, very far, I would advise you to meditate.
Okay, so maybe the last question or a comment on what you've basically been saying now. We've talked a lot about this distinction, both distinction and similarities between meditation and the explication interview and the gesture of awareness in general. But haven't really said much, only incidentally. So as something that was, on the periphery, this relationship between the explication interview, meditation, and therapy. So to what degree, because therapy is also mentioned here. And for example, it is mentioned in the embodied mind as one of the approaches that could be useful in a similar manner to a certain degree for the study or approaching of the lived experience. But of course, there are important differences, and you've already mentioned them so far. So what would you say, could there be okay, we were talking about constructing bridges. Could there be a productive bridge between psychotherapy and the explication interview? Could explication interview morph into something, change into something eventually that could be a hybrid between therapy and explication interview?
No, Sebastjan, I just tried to explain that for now, this technique, the explicitation interview, is not a therapeutic tool.
Mm-hmm.
And it cannot be used. It could be a complementary tool for a therapist. It could be used from time to time to explore very, very finely a moment of experience. But it is not as such a therapeutic tool. Yeah, that's all that can answer.
But do you think that also the opposite might be true? So, for example, that the explication interview, not in its present form, but let's say in some future form, might benefit from having certain segments from the therapeutic practice included in it? Or do you think that this is not necessarily something that would be a good thing to do?
Difficult for me to imagine how a therapeutic practice could be included in the interview. It's easier for me to imagine the
opposite, yeah.
The opposite. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, Claire, we've been torturing you for enough time, so I would really like to kindly thank you again for your presentation, and thank you for all your reflections and the discussion. And I would at the same time also like to thank all the participants and everyone who has participated in this, either explicitly, so by posing question, or implicitly by simply co-creating a specific horizon of meaning that we were moving in. So thank you very much, and I'll be seeing you in 2 weeks. Claire, thanks again. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.